Come see these during the break, feel free. Lee mentioned that I'm also an artist, and the medium I work with is cut paper. And I was being interviewed by a newspaper reporter one day, and she said, "Why paper? What's your relationship with paper?" And that's the story I'm going to tell tonight, is about my relationship with paper. It was too long a story to explain to the newspaper reporter that day, as you will see. But the name of this story is Paperwork. When I was a wee tiny girl, my father taught me how to play rock, paper, scissors. And I was an inquisitive kid, so I had questions right away. I could understand how scissors beats paper, because we were always cutting shapes out of construction paper with scissors at school. So I got that. And it made sense that rock beats scissors. You could break scissors or windows or even injure people with a rock. But how could paper overcome a rock? That was a mystery. My father tried to explain it to me, that a piece of paper could cover a rock, but I wasn't satisfied. He just smiled and shook his head, and that was the end of the discussion. I pondered the puzzling powers of paper for weeks after that. I was about eye to eye with that mail slot you used to have in the front door. I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember those, but I am. And it occurred to me that one property of paper was that people from far away could write you messages on a piece of paper, and a postal carrier would bring it and push the envelope through that slot in the front door. Well, that was kind of neat. You couldn't do that with rocks. And even more amazing, in the upper corner of those envelopes, there were little teeny tiny pieces of paper that made it possible for that mail carrier to bring that letter to you from anywhere in the world. Now that was something. That was magic. So tonight, I'd like to tell you a story about stamps and my father. I knew a lot about postage stamps because my father would take those envelopes, and after they were done reading the letters, he would soak the envelopes in bowls of water. They were all over the house, to get the stamps to come loose. And then he would put them in a press with blotting paper, and when they were all flat and dry, he put them in his stamp albums. He had thousands of stamps, so I knew that stamps came in all shapes and sizes from all around the world. But to understand the story of my father and stamps, we need to travel back in time and space. We need to go to Germany 80 years ago. And for that, we are going to need a very big envelope. This graphic represents April 1st, 1939. That was the day when my father, Kurt, escaped Nazi Germany with his parents, his little sister, and his uncle Walter. It was 4 days before Kurt's 15th birthday. They had traveled to the port of Hamburg. I don't think he'd ever been to the ocean. They had lived in the little town of Halle, about 380 kilometers from there. His world had been very small up to that point. They had their paperwork in order that day. They had passports, birth certificates, police certificates, health certificates, and more for all 5 of them. They had report cards for the children, and they even had a letter of reference from Kurt's former employer. His passport is right here, if any of you want to come look at it later. This is how he described that day in his own words, recorded by me many years later. We had to go through customs control, because in those days, at that time, Jews were not allowed to leave the country with anything more than 1 wedding ring with no jewels in it per adult. Just 1 gold band. and $10 currency. They went through our luggage looking for other things. And you know, sometimes things get a little screwed up. I had a stamp collection, but when they looked at it, and they looked at us in our ragged clothes and with our few possessions, apparently they figured that a 15-year-old boy from such a poor family couldn't own much of a stamp collection. So they didn't touch it, and actually, it was the most valuable possession we had. How Kurt's stamp collection got through customs that day is a mystery, or a miracle, or maybe a little bit of each. But what was even more miraculous was that they were able to leave the country at all. And to understand that, we have to go back another 6 months in time to the morning after Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. And for that, we have another envelope. So now we're back in Halle. When Kurt came down the steps from his family's apartment on the morning of November 10th, 1938, it seemed just like any other day. It was a cold November morning. Their apartment, their living quarters, were situated above a row of 7 garages that were rented out to an auto repair business. And it was surrounded on all sides by buildings with higher walls. On mornings like this, it seemed to Kurt that those walls blocked out not just the visibility of the town, but the air itself. The way he described it to me when I was a little girl was when the wind blew, all the smoke came back down our chimney and blew out the coal stove into our house, so we had to open up the windows. Kurt came down the steps and walked out into the courtyard on his way to his work as an apprentice lithographer at the Halle paper goods factory. It was not a job he enjoyed. The Nuremberg laws made it impossible for Jewish boys after grade 8 to stay in school. So he was forced to find an apprenticeship when he was 14 years old. And it couldn't be in just any business, because as he explained to me, a Jewish boy couldn't find an apprenticeship in a non-Jewish business. They absolutely wouldn't hire you. Lucky for Kurt, well, and I should explain also, the town of Halle only had about 1% Jewish population, so it wasn't easy for him to find someone to sponsor him for an apprenticeship. But the family had a friend, Max Jovashoff, who owned the Halle paper goods factory, and he hired Kurt in April of 1938. When Kurt walked out to the street, things still seemed normal, but between where he was and the paper factory, there was a Jewish wholesale business. And here is how he described it. When I walked by that business, suddenly I saw the mess. I saw the fire-blackened walls and the broken windows and all the merchandise thrown out into the street. They had ruined him totally. And then Kurt realized it wasn't like any other day. Many things happened rapidly over the next 2 days. This is how he described it in his own words. Over the next day or the next 2 days, they rounded up all the Jewish men between ages 15 and 60. I was only 14, so they didn't take me, but they took my older cousin, Werner Friedman, they took my uncle Walter, and they took my father Paul. They put them all in concentration camps. In those days, they didn't really send people to concentration camps to kill them. They just re-educated them by beating them. And if people held to their beliefs, if they couldn't be re-educated, Then they were beaten to death. My cousin Werner and my uncle Walter were sent to Buchenwald near Weimar, and my father Paul was sent to Sachsenhausen near Berlin. One man whom they did not take was a man named Hirsch. We had sort of a Jewish community center in Halle, the Gemeinde House, and Hirsch was kind of the custodian of the Gemeinde House. In the First World War, Hirsch had lost one arm and one leg, so they left him alone, and the Gestapo used him as sort of a contact between the Gestapo and all the women and children who were left behind in Halle. They had Mr. Hirsch call us together into the Gemeinde House, and the Gestapo spoke to us, and this is what they said. You are advised, if you ever want to see your husbands and fathers again, to make immediate plans for emigration. Well, this created quite a dilemma for us, because where in the world were we going to go? No country was willing to take us. The next day, Max Jovashoff was forced to terminate Kurt's employment at the Halle paper goods factory. There's a letter here that Max wrote, and I want to thank Ilse Halling for translating it to me. This is what it says. Certificate of Employment. This is to certify that Kurt Schwabach, born April 6, 1924, has been employed in our factory from April 1st, 1938 until today, November 12th, 1938. He has worked as an apprentice lithographer in our offset printing and copy department. His work was always impeccable. His professional conduct was exemplary at all times. His termination is necessitated by the required Aryanization of our factory. Signed, Max Jovashoff, Halle Paper Goods Company. At the same time that all of this was happening in 1938, the Gestapo was considering a program of removing all the German Jews from Germany through forced emigration to China. It's kind of an obscure fact that I only learned myself recently. So under this program, the Gestapo had commissioned some merchant ships and converted them to passenger ships with the idea of using them to transport the entire Jewish population of Germany to Shanghai. Shanghai was known for its loose paperwork. You could enter there without a visa. And one of the ships that was commissioned for this purpose was the steamship Usoramo of the German East Africa Line. And in this first picture, in the background, is the Usoramo herself. Mm-hmm. The way Kurt described it is that a few days later, Mr. Hirsch called everyone back to the Gemeinde House to inform them that the Gestapo had chartered the Usoramo and outfitted it with 450 bunk beds. That would be enough to transport all the women and children of Halle and the men who they would be reunited with in Hamburg and take them to Shanghai. What was required was for the families to pull all the paperwork together. It took several months, and when it was finished, they were put on a train that went directly from Halle to Hamburg. When Kurt and his mother and his little sister arrived in Hamburg, they were reunited with his father Paul and his uncle Walter. Paul and Walter had lost a lot of weight, and they were not in very good health, but they had survived, and the family was happy to be together. So the family and all of their paperwork and Kurt's stamp collection went through customs, and they boarded this ship. What would happen to them next was a complete mystery, but they hoped it would be better than what they were leaving behind. It's a miracle that they were able to escape. They were chosen out of 500,000 Jewish people in Germany for this voyage, and the program was discontinued very shortly after that. In short, 17,000 Jews, an estimated 17,000 Jews from all over Central Europe managed to immigrate to Shanghai. But most of them were very wealthy people who had purchased all the seats on the passenger lines. And that's why the Gestapo had to commission merchant ships. All the passenger tickets were sold out. At Stories on Friday in January, I will return and tell you about the journey from Hamburg to Shanghai. It was an amazing voyage. But for tonight, my time is running short, so I'd like to just leave you with this. In Shanghai, where Kurt and his family remained for 8 long years, as things became more desperate, he sold off his stamp collection, piece by piece and bit by bit. When I was a little girl, I watched him reassemble his stamp collection. He spent his whole life at it. He passed 20 years ago, but he left an enormous stamp collection that I still have much of, and the stamps that you see on these posters tonight all came out of his stamp collection to go on this artwork. He left me stamps from Germany in the 1890s through his entire lifetime. And I still look at them from time to time. And to me, it's like reading the journal of his life, the journal of a man who always chose stamps over stones, and who taught me the miraculous qualities of paper.